The late afternoon sun hung low over the fields, casting long shadows across the worn dirt path leading to Reed Farm. The land, once thriving, now bore the marks of hardship. Fences sagged, crops withered in their rows, and the old barn leaned slightly, as if burdened by the weight of time. Thomas Reed stepped onto his front porch, wiping the sweat from his brow with a calloused hand. His boots, caked in dust, felt heavier than usual, the weight of the world pressing down with every step. He glanced toward the pastures, where only a few tired animals grazed. There was a time when his farm had been a source of pride, a place filled with laughter and life. But those days were gone. His wife, Margaret, had passed 3 years ago, leaving an emptiness that even the wide-open land could not fill. His children, grown and distant, had left in search of something better, something easier. Now, it was just him and Rusty, his aging shepherd dog, whose once vibrant coat had turned gray around the muzzle. The farm was more than a home. It was a legacy, one that Thomas had sworn to protect, even as the bank threatened to take it from him. A distant sound stirred him from his thoughts. The low murmur of voices carried on the breeze, punctuated by bursts of laughter. He turned toward the road, spotting a small group of men in fine suits passing by in a horse-drawn carriage. They were heading toward the town's livestock auction, no doubt in search of prime breeding stock. Thomas had no reason to attend. He had nothing to sell, and certainly no money to buy. But something in him, perhaps boredom, perhaps curiosity, compelled him to follow. The auction grounds buzzed with energy. Wealthy ranchers stood in clusters, discussing bloodlines and pedigrees, their voices thick with confidence. Thomas moved through the crowd, feeling like an outsider in his worn flannel and patched jeans. He recognized a few faces, men who once sought his advice on farming, now looking past him as if he were part of the scenery. He ignored the sting of it, focusing instead on the spectacle before him. A sleek black stallion pranced onto the stage, its coat gleaming under the fading sunlight. The auctioneer's voice rang out, fast and commanding, as bids shot up in rapid succession. The price climbed higher and higher, reaching figures that made Thomas's stomach tighten. It was a different world, one where men flaunted their wealth with the flick of a paddle, where animals were bought and sold like trophies. Horse after horse came and went, each more expensive than the last. Thomas was about to turn away when the energy in the crowd shifted. A few chuckles rippled through the onlookers, and he turned back to see a stark contrast to the previous entrance. A thin, aging horse was led onto the stage, its ribs visible beneath a dull coat. Its mane, once thick, hung in tangled strands. The animal moved with hesitation, its legs stiff with age. The crowd erupted in laughter. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer drawled, barely suppressing a smirk, "I present to you, well, whatever this is." More laughter. A fine addition to any collection, if your collection happens to be the town glue factory. Thomas felt a pang in his chest. The animal stood there, silent, as if it had long since accepted its fate. He had seen broken things before, broken land, broken men, but there was something in the horse's eyes that struck him, a quiet dignity, a resilience that refused to be mocked. "Come on now, do I hear $1?" The auctioneer's tone was playful, meant to amuse. Silence. The handlers began to pull the horse off the stage, signaling its fate was sealed. But before Thomas could think, his hand was in the air. $1, he said. The crowd erupted again, this time in outright hilarity. "Mr. Reed," the auctioneer said, shaking his head, "mighty generous of you." The gavel came down. "Sold." Thomas barely registered the murmurs around him. He stepped forward, taking the rope from the handler. The horse, close now, smelled of dust and age. Rusty, who had followed at his heels, sniffed at the animal before giving an approving wag of his tail. "You've done it now, old boy," Thomas murmured, rubbing the horse's muzzle. "Let's get you home." The journey back was slow. The horse, which he decided to call Gideon, moved with a stiffness that made Thomas wonder if the laughter at the auction had been justified. But each step the animal took was steady, determined. It wasn't weakness that made Gideon slow, it was patience. A kind of patience Thomas understood well. Back at the farm, Thomas led Gideon into the barn. The dim light cast long shadows over the wooden stalls, dust swirling in the air. He ran a hand over the horse's side, feeling the rough texture of its coat. Something caught his eye. Beneath the dirt and wear, faint patterns traced over the horse's skin, almost like scars, but more deliberate. He frowned, brushing away the grime. The marks resembled symbols, old and faded, nearly impossible to decipher. He shook his head. "Just an old horse," he muttered to himself, though doubt lingered. That night, sleep was restless. Dreams came in flickers, images of horses thundering across open plains, their bodies moving like shadows under a moonlit sky. One stood apart, glowing white, its mane flowing like silver thread. It turned toward him, its eyes locking with his. The gaze was familiar. Thomas woke with a start. The barn door creaked in the wind, the distant sound of crickets filling the night. He sat up, rubbing his face. Just a dream. Morning arrived with golden light spilling over the hills. Thomas stepped outside, expecting to find Gideon still resting. Instead, the horse stood tall, alert, its eyes locked on the horizon. There was a presence about him, something different than the frail creature he had led home. The coat, still dull, seemed to hold a deeper shine beneath the surface. Rusty barked, breaking the moment. Thomas exhaled, shaking off the unease creeping up his spine. "Well," he muttered, grabbing a brush, "let's clean you up." As he worked through the knots in Gideon's mane, his fingers brushed against the hidden symbols once more. The sensation sent a strange chill up his arm. He had spent his life around animals, knew their quirks, their temperaments. But Gideon was something else, something he couldn't quite explain. He decided not to dwell on it. By midday, Gideon moved with more ease. Thomas watched as the horse navigated the pasture, testing the ground with careful steps. The stiffness from the previous night seemed to lessen. The improvement was subtle but undeniable. A sudden gust of wind rustled the trees, sending a ripple through the grass. Thomas turned, his gaze sweeping the land. For the first time in years, the place didn't feel empty. A movement in the distance caught his attention. A carriage rolling down the road, heading toward town. Inside, dressed in fine clothes, sat a man with sharp eyes and a calculating expression. He glanced toward Thomas's farm as he passed, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. Thomas didn't know him, but the feeling in his gut told him their paths would cross soon enough. For now, he turned back to Gideon, unaware that the horse he had bought for $1 held a secret that would change everything. The morning mist clung to the pastures, curling in delicate tendrils around the wooden fence posts. Thomas stood at the edge of the field, his hands resting on the worn rails, watching as Gideon moved through the grass. There was something different about the old horse, something that made the farmer's skin prickle with unease. Only a day had passed since the auction, yet Gideon seemed to carry himself with newfound strength. His gait no longer stiff, his posture no longer weary. It defied logic. Thomas had spent his life around horses. He had seen them age, watched them decline, understood the slow, inevitable erosion of time on muscle and bone. But Gideon was changing. He no longer looked like the frail, forgotten creature that had stood under the auction house lights. His coat, though still dusty, seemed thicker now, the dull sheen giving way to something richer beneath the grime. His eyes, once heavy with defeat, held a sharpness that hadn't been there before. Rusty let out a low growl beside him, ears pricked forward as he watched Gideon. It wasn't fear. Thomas had known Rusty too long to mistake the old dog's reactions, but there was an awareness in the animal's posture, a wariness that made Thomas uneasy. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the change was nothing more than the result of a good night's rest and the promise of food. Or maybe, his fingers tightened around the fence, maybe there was something else at work. Before he could dwell on it further, the sound of hooves on dirt reached his ears. He turned, spotting a carriage rolling up the path toward the farm, the same one he had seen passing the previous evening. The horses came to a halt just beyond the gate, their harnesses jingling as the driver pulled back on the reins. From the carriage emerged a man dressed in a crisp, dark suit, his polished boots barely collecting dust as he stepped onto the ground. His presence felt deliberate, calculated. as if every movement was measured for effect. Thomas squared his shoulders. "Help you with something?" The man smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Reed, I presume?" His voice was smooth, practiced. "My name is Elias Mercer." Thomas recognized the name. Mercer was a businessman, a man who dealt in land and livestock, though his interests extended far beyond simple farming. He had a reputation for acquiring what he wanted, by any means necessary. "Can't say we've met before," Thomas replied, keeping his tone neutral. "No, we haven't," Mercer acknowledged. His gaze flicked past Thomas, settling briefly on Gideon. "I happened to be at the auction yesterday. Quite the purchase you made." Thomas tensed. Didn't seem like anyone else wanted him. Mercer's smile widened slightly. "That's what makes it so interesting." Thomas said nothing, waiting. "You see," Mercer continued, "I've been looking for a particular horse, an animal of unique value, and I believe the one you acquired may be it." Thomas frowned. "You're telling me you're interested in an old, half-starved nag?" Mercer chuckled, the sound devoid of warmth. "Let's just say I have an appreciation for things others overlook." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, tossing it onto the fence post between them. The weight of it was unmistakable, the clinking sound of coins echoing in the still morning air. "I'll pay you 10 times what you spent. A generous offer, wouldn't you say?" Thomas looked down at the pouch, but made no move to touch it. His gut twisted. Something was wrong. "I'm not selling," he said flatly. Mercer's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or something darker. "Are you sure?" Thomas crossed his arms. "Not interested." Mercer exhaled through his nose, a slow, measured breath. "That's unfortunate." He reached for the pouch, tucking it back into his coat. "A man in your position could use a bit of extra money, could he not?" Thomas's jaw tightened. He didn't like threats, especially not the kind that came wrapped in polite words. "I manage just fine." Mercer studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Very well. But should you change your mind, I won't be far." With that, he turned back toward the carriage, stepping inside without another word. The driver flicked the reins, and within moments, the vehicle was gone, leaving only a trail of dust in its wake. Thomas watched until the carriage disappeared beyond the trees, his hands clenched at his sides. The uneasy feeling in his chest had only grown stronger. Behind him, Gideon let out a soft huff, shifting his weight. Thomas turned back, staring at the horse, as if the animal held the answers he was missing. Something was happening, and he needed to find out what. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, an oil lamp casting flickering shadows along the walls. He had pulled out an old ledger, filled with notes and records from his years of farming. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, perhaps anything that might give him insight into Mercer's interest in Gideon. His fingers tapped against the worn wooden surface. The symbols. He had seen them before. Not in books, not in ledgers, but somewhere else. Somewhere older. Rising from his chair, he grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The barn loomed in the darkness, its silhouette sharp against the moonlit sky. Rusty followed at his heels, silent. Inside, Gideon stood calmly in his stall, his head lifting slightly as Thomas approached. The air smelled of hay and aged wood, familiar scents that should have been comforting. Thomas ran his hand along the horse's side once more, tracing the symbols hidden beneath the dirt. The moment his fingers brushed over them, a strange warmth spread through his palm, like an ember sparking to life. His breath hitched. It wasn't normal. Rusty let out a soft whimper, his tail tucked low. Thomas swallowed hard, stepping back. His heart pounded, his mind racing through possibilities. He didn't believe in superstitions, didn't put stock in stories of magic or curses. But something about Gideon defied explanation, and Elias Mercer knew it. A gust of wind rattled the barn doors, making them creak in protest. The feeling of being watched crept up Thomas's spine, though he saw nothing beyond the darkness outside. He exhaled slowly. Whatever secrets Gideon held, they weren't staying buried for long. Tomorrow he would ride. He would see for himself what Mercer wanted so badly, and then, perhaps, he would understand. The wind howled through the valley, bending the tall grasses as Thomas urged Gideon forward. The horse's hooves struck the earth with a rhythm that matched the pounding of Thomas's heart. He had spent the morning preparing, securing his worn leather saddle and ensuring his rifle was within reach, though he wasn't even sure what he expected to face. What he did know was that Mercer wouldn't stop. Not until he had what he wanted. Gideon's muscles moved beneath him like coiled steel, each stride smooth and deliberate. There was power here, far more than there should have been in an old auction horse. The way he carried himself, the way his ears flicked forward as if listening to something beyond human perception, it unsettled Thomas more than he cared to admit. The trail curved through the hills, leading toward the dense forest that bordered his land. He hadn't planned on riding so deep into the woods, but something pulled at him, an invisible thread guiding him forward. He gave Gideon the reins, trusting the horse to take him where he needed to go. Branches clawed at the sky above, casting shifting patterns of shadow and light on the path ahead. Rusty had stayed behind, uneasy ever since the strange warmth had coursed through Thomas's palm the night before. The memory of it lingered, the sensation as unnatural as Mercer's visit. A sharp crack rang through the trees. Thomas tensed, tightening his grip on the reins. Gideon halted, ears pricked, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Another sound, closer this time. Footsteps. Thomas reached for his rifle, but before he could lift it, a figure stepped onto the path. Elias Mercer. He was dressed as immaculately as before, dark suit untouched by the dust and dirt of the trail. His expression was unreadable, but his posture spoke volumes. He had been waiting. "Riding alone, Mr. Reed?" Mercer's voice was calm, but there was something sharp beneath it. Thomas kept his rifle steady across his lap. "Didn't know I needed company." Mercer took a slow step forward. "You have something that belongs to me." Thomas exhaled, steadying his pulse. "Funny. I don't remember stealing anything." Mercer's gaze flickered to Gideon. "Not all theft is intentional." The horse shifted beneath him, weight rolling slightly from one hoof to the other. Thomas didn't move. "Enough games," Mercer continued. "I know what that horse is, and I know you've started to see it too." Thomas remained silent. "The symbols," Mercer pressed. "You felt them, haven't you? The way they burn beneath your touch." Thomas's fingers twitched. He had spent most of his life believing in what he could see, what he could touch, what made sense. But nothing about Gideon followed those rules. "What do you want with him?" he asked finally. Mercer's lips curved slightly. "That's not the right question." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "The right question," Mercer continued, taking another step, "is what he wants with you." A chill crept down Thomas's spine. Mercer gestured toward the horse. "You've seen him change, haven't you? You felt the strength returning, the way he moves, the intelligence in his eyes. He's not an ordinary horse. He never was." Thomas swallowed. "And yet," Mercer mused, "you refuse to let him go." Thomas straightened in the saddle. "I don't answer to you." Mercer sighed. "No, I suppose you don't." He tilted his head slightly, studying them both. "But that won't change what's coming." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with something unspoken. Then, without another word, Mercer turned and disappeared into the trees, his movements eerily quiet. Thomas exhaled slowly, his grip on the rifle tight. He didn't trust Mercer, but the man's warning had lodged itself deep in his chest. Gideon let out a low huff, shifting beneath him. Thomas took the reins and turned back toward the farm. Whatever Mercer had meant, whatever truth he thought he knew, Thomas would find out himself. The ride back was uneventful, but the unease remained. By the time they reached the barn, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the fields. Thomas dismounted, running a hand along Gideon's flank, feeling the warmth beneath his palm. He couldn't deny it any longer. Something was waking inside this horse, and somehow it was tied to him. That night, he barely slept. The wind rattled the windows, the distant sound of hooves echoing in his dreams. When dawn broke, he knew one thing for certain. He needed to uncover the truth before it was too late.